All right. I see the recording has started. So
Yep.
thank you all for joining. We've got, looks like, close to 100 participants. And so I'm going to be, I'll just briefly introduce myself, and then I'll give you guys a quick outline of what I plan to do over the next half hour or so. And then, so Al Youssef, as you guys have seen, I have been in the financial services industry for a bit over a quarter of a century now, which is scary when you put it that way. 22 years at Goldman Sachs and coming up on 5 years at JP Morgan. I started off as a developer. I was a C and C++ developer, but then eventually started to move up the leadership ranks, tech lead, project management leadership, and then ultimately as a manager. For the last, I guess, 15 years or so, I guess we would say that I've been more of a senior manager running multiple development teams, but always very much tied to development, software development. And as I noted in the comments, there was, there's always been a view that I've had that when you're working in a business type industry like financial services, then you're always going to have people who are incentivized to deliver for their businesses. But if you are ultimately trying to develop software, then the groups that actually have the strongest engineering practices and the groups that really optimize around building a very strong development team are the ones that win out over time. And so, going all the way back to university, I was a finance and computer science major. So I've always been equally interested in both sides of the equation. But as a technology leader, I'd like to think that I focus more on the engineering practices. As Gene said, then when, I am familiar with LeSS. Teams of mine have gone through LeSS training, and some of them actually have, are really pretty strong practitioners or adopters of LeSS. Just to give a sense, my organizations have generally been in like the 300 to 500 developer range over the last several years. So I run groups that have multiple development teams. There are varying degrees of agility in those teams. I am very much anti-waterfall, so there's no waterfall development going on in any of my teams, I don't think. And some of the groups, they're smaller, some of them are much larger. The largest code bases that my teams have managed were in excess of 2 million lines of code. And I know that often doesn't mean a whole lot because people say you could just like proliferate lines indefinitely, but the 2 million plus line code base was actually led by a group of senior technical leaders who used to compete on how many lines they would delete in each check-in, and not just adding. So people were actually always very, very motivated to keep things, don't repeat yourself, keep things simple, refactor. So ultimately, over the years, I've really come to appreciate and respect, a lot of the agile principles, and LeSS particularly is a discipline that resonates with me. And so when Gene asked me to talk, the question was, well, what am I going to talk about? And we looked at some of the principles and the experiments that were out there. Many more than the ones that I listed resonated. And what I'll do over the next, like I said, 25 minutes to a half hour is just walk people through some of my evolving learnings and experiences over the years, and how they map to some of these principles. We have approximately 100 people on the call, and so if anyone wants to get a question in, unmute yourself and you can ask a question as we're going. I won't be offended if you do that, but I will also leave at least 20 minutes at the end of this for people to ask questions during more of a Q&A. All right, so getting rolling on this. As I said, I started off as a developer. What's interesting is that, back when I started as a developer back in 1993, the idea of test-driven development was not, had not strongly been adopted in the world. It existed, but it had not strongly been adopted. And the idea of doing things like delivering iteratively and making sure that you are delivering a fully working product at all times was, actually, there are things that, I guess I somewhat naturally kind of gravitated towards that, but it wasn't necessarily the way that the groups or the teams that I were in operated. But in 2000, I became responsible for a pretty large software development team. It was a global team of about 70 developers, and they really were predominantly working on one product. And we were rewriting that product soup to nuts, front to back. And I was blessed with a couple of very strong senior developers and architects, and they were very hands-on individuals. And they really taught me the value of engineering practices and engineering at scale. And so really kind of like some of the basic fundamentals, that's where I started to learn, you know, you must have a robust suite of tests. If you don't have that robust suite of tests, you can have no confidence in, you know, making changes or dramatic changes. You can actually move a lot more quickly the more robust your test suite. This is all basic stuff. So yes, try, all, test, pass, stop, and fix. We basically instituted a continuous integration, you know, requirement in the early 2000s. And anyone who broke the build was named and shamed, and you know, people were not allowed to go home if they had a check-in that broke the build. And then we started to evolve towards, as you increase the automated test suite, then it became actually, we realized that it was just better to express our requirements in the form of tests that were automated tests. You know, how do you know that you've actually got it right? Well, if you have this set of tests that work and they're fully automated and they can run over and over again, then you know you're good. And so we increasingly started to explore requirements as automated tests. And so that was discipline that really, at this point now, my teams really started to embed and exercise in their practices 17 or 18 years ago. It was interesting because a lot of times like I said, I've been in a bank my whole career. There are very urgent requirements, you know, business imperatives, things move quickly. Control and regulatory requirements have always been, you know, part and parcel with the functions that I've supported. And so there's often a lot of urgency to move quickly, and you have to really resist and hold back and make sure that people aren't taking short-term decisions and that they're managing the amount of debt that they are allowing to, you know, to be introduced into their applications. And so what I found that was actually most rewarding in that time period, and like what I started to experience, was that our users actually started to realize, after we had a couple of years of like successful deliveries that were really based off of really strong engineering practices, they started to realize the value of having like stability and taking the extra time that I had been sort of like explaining to them. This is a transparency discipline as well. You know, transparency being one of the key LeSS principles. You know, we were very transparent about the things that we were doing that were quote unquote extra things, so that we were not accumulating debt. And anytime we accumulated debt, it was really a fairly conscious choice. And we explained that to our users, and we told them, if we're going to introduce this, we're going to have to come back and clean this up after the fact. And they were very understanding of this, because when we said we were going to release, we released. And when we released pretty cleanly, because we had a good we had the good backing of automated tests. And so this actually increased a great deal of confidence amongst our user community. And it was just really rewarding to see that by doing things right and not necessarily chasing the short-term release or the short-term benefits, we were actually able to build up a platform that enjoyed a very strong reputation over the course of a couple of years. So it was actually really interesting and really good to see that, you know, that if you actually do things the right way, any one delivery might be a little bit longer, or might take longer than if you had actually tried to rush it. But over time, you can actually deliver a lot more. Over the course of a year, over the course of years, you can deliver a great deal more. You can move a lot more nimbly, and you can move a lot more quickly. And that definitely proved itself out during the financial crisis. At the time, I was responsible for all of the corporate finance applications at Goldman Sachs. And so if you think about it, things like the general ledger, you know, all of the quarterly earnings releases, all of the management, you know, financial management summaries, things that went out to regulators, all of these were systems that were under my responsibility. And you know, as the financial crisis came, and as the regulatory scrutiny went up, the ability to move quickly and the ability to adapt to regulatory and audit scrutiny much more quickly, it really started to pay off. a lot of the, a couple of core frameworks that were developed in my applications at those times ultimately ended up being open sourced. The most notable of them is what is now known as Eclipse Collections. So it is the Eclipse Foundation's collections, Java collections framework that was actually initially created in one of the applications that was developed in that time, ultimately ended up being open sourced. And so kind of went on. As my organizations grew bigger, one of the big things that I then would do is I would try to understand to what extent were people adhering to and obeying these principles, and to what extent did we have the right people to do that. And so this is kind of that was kind of like the basis and the genesis of a journey that I and my teams have taken over the last decade and a half or so. So coming more to present day, I'm now responsible for groups. I'm in the corporate technology part of JP Morgan. I'm in the area that supports all the functions that are not implicitly revenue generating. So finance, market and credit risk, human resources, real estate, security, legal, compliance, internal audit, like those types of functions. That's a very large application area at JP Morgan. Of the 50,000 technologists in JP Morgan Chase, about 8,500 or so, or 9,000 are in the corporate technology space. And I'm responsible for the applications that ultimately manage all the shared data and the shared data platforms. There's quite a lot of data that flows through these systems. JP Morgan Chase is the largest deposit holder and the largest issuer of loans in the United States. That ends up being tens of millions of records that flow through on a daily basis, like of positions that flow through on a daily basis. We literally have billions of records flowing through our systems. And so we have a variety of what I would consider to be more legacy platforms, but we're building out a strategic data lake platform. And we've been doing that for the past couple of years. That development team is approximately 100 people. That are dedicated to this strategic data platform. And it's one code base, which is broken down into multiple components. It's a very large project. And we have probably another 40 or 50 developers from other parts of corporate technology contributing to that code base. So you're talking about a code base that literally has about 150 people checking into the same code base on a daily basis. I think that does qualify for large scale. In terms of the overall scope and scale of the product. And so, it's the team's been built up somewhat organically over the past 3 years. And the product itself has expanded in its scope, but it's really kind of as this application and this platform, it is intended to be the strategic data platform for all of the shared corporate data. So all of the loans that the firm operates are, that the firm issues, people care about that across the different corporate functions. So we really want to have one representation of that, all the deposits, all the derivative products, all the securities holdings, all the financing and, instruments that we trade. And there also are other things like all of the employees of the firm, all of the risks that are being managed across the corporate functions. There's just tons and tons and tons of data that is shared across the functions, and having a single platform to manage all this for everyone is of critical commercial importance to us. So how then have we organized ourselves? And again, this isn't something that just happened over the past couple of years. It's like kind of the engineering practices, the organizational practices of things that have grown. So I decided to organize the experiments that were in that little write-up that Gene posted by themes. So most important, most foundationally, the principle of continuous improvement toward perfection. One of the key underlying aspects of that is respect for people. And the experiment that we have is reflect on the two pillars of really respect for people and continuous improvement. First and foremost, you don't actually build a development team of 100 people in one fell swoop, hiring 100 new people or co-opting 100 developers from different parts of the organization at one time. You're going to build that up. Even if you're doing it so quickly, you're going to do it over a period of time. people are not going to be accustomed to exactly what is it like to work in this type of environment. What are the dynamics of this software product, and how will it change over time? So we had to start with a set of senior leaders who were very, very technically minded folks, but who are adaptable, who are flexible, and who are willing to kind of, learn from what we were doing organizationally. Our Scrum team organization, our feature team organization, has changed multiple times over the past couple of years, and we recently, shifted the focus a little bit a couple of months ago. I would say the changes were more dramatic early on. They've been more tweaks more recently, but you really have to start with, like, if you do not have empowerment and people who are authorized to make local decisions, it's never going to work. You cannot actually drive top-down agility in any way, shape, or form just by one person mandating directions at a very detailed level. So we basically really have had to embrace, people being quite autonomous and understanding what our principles, understanding what our goals, understanding what our engineering practices are, but really focused on making sure that they are empowered to make local decisions, following consistent practice, consistent process globally. And we are continually looking at data and continually looking at anecdotal evidence to see how easy is it to release our software, how happy are our stakeholders and our clients, what's the performance and stability of the platform, and we're continually making improvements. And so that's software really is a people industry. If you don't have really good people working in a really great culture, you're not going to get great results. And so I try to never lose sight of that. I try to make sure my leadership teams never lose sight of that. And that's really kind of pillar number one. Everything is really based off of that. So then, I described briefly, we have a data platform that's trying to transact literally hundreds of millions of records or billions of records a day over time. If you think about it, most applications have historically run in single tenant database platforms. Like, you own your own Oracle or your Sybase or Microsoft SQL Server, or, more recently, you might have your own kind of like Cassandra or MongoDB instance. Even if you're running like in a Hadoop cluster, a lot of times people will be running in their own kind of dedicated cluster. If you have a big multi-tenant environment within a corporate setting, you may have 5, 10 applications running in that. Our environment already has something like 35 distinct applications using it as kind of like a primary data store, and that's going to grow dramatically. So you have to really now start to think, so this is where I guess systems thinking and the whole product focus comes into play. So I'm going to anchor this to less and lean principles, and then reference the experiments that we're talking about. So, knowing knowing your system goals in lean thinking, everything is intended. Like, if you're actually going to really build a great product for your customer, you really have to know what the broader goals are of the system. And you have to really understand, what are we trying to accomplish? If people are just operating in a very localized way, they're not going to be making good decisions. They're not going to be making broader choices. And one of the key things that we had to do was, the chief engineer with business acumen as the chief product manager. And I actually I was on the LeSS Works website, and I pulled out a little blurb and said, the LeSS product owner is a connector of customers or users and their teams rather than an intermediary. So we started off by building this data platform for a couple of particular use cases that were reasonably different use cases in terms of how they interacted with data and what type of load they put on the platform. But there were another half dozen or so applications that were trying to run in the platform in different ways. And if you think about a data lake platform, it's registry sent. You have to register your data, you bring it in, you ultimately have to you process it, you pull it out. Every one of those things, every one of those components has feature teams or multiple feature teams, and so you have lots of people who are really focused on the engineering of a core product. But then our clients, they need a platform that allows them to transact data. And they're interested in particular patterns of usage that are very client-focused, client-centric. And the more you understand about what their business is driving them to do, and the more you understand of the nature of their use case based off of what their ultimate business requirements are, the better off you're going to be in making large scale decisions for the platform. And so I ended up, stepping in the early days, and I still am officially the chief product owner or the chief product manager for this data platform product, despite the fact that I'm also the manager of a much larger organization. And the reason for that is that I've had the benefit of working across a very large number of corporate functions over the last 20 years. I've been responsible for a number of corporate functions from the technology point of view at JP Morgan, and I was responsible for more than that when I was at Goldman. So I have a quite good business understanding of what the different corporate functions are trying to do. And it ended up being, until we actually had that business overlay of what's really important to enable from a usage pattern point of view, we actually were making some pretty short-sighted decisions, or decisions that when we actually delivered what we were building, it ended up not quite meeting our users or stakeholders' requirements. And so I think that in a large diversified team, you're going to have folks who are really, really technically focused, but you still do have to have people who have ultimately very good line of sight into what the customers are ultimately trying to do. And so chief engineer with business acumen, I think that that's absolutely critical in having a product owner. In this case, our product owners are on the tech side because we're building tech for tech. In other applications of mine, the product owners are on the business side because we're building tech for business. But for a platform like this, in any platform, you always have to have someone who really has a holistic view of client needs. And that leads us then into the next LeSS principle that I wanted to talk about, customer-centric. And so that really gets to two of the experiments here, one product owner and one product backlog, and organize around requirement areas. And these are two areas I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. So the first one product owner and one product backlog. In the early days of the platform, we didn't have enough people who were really that good about organizing things. We had a lot of people who were very strong technicians, people who came from more of a data platform background, people who had big data experience, but who weren't necessarily super organized. And so we ended up, despite the fact that we wanted one backlog, we ended up realistically having multiple backlogs. The part of the platform that was concerned with persisting data and actually like having performance storage was one backlog. The part of the platform that was really about processing data was another. Entitlements had its own backlog. Pulling data out had its backlog. And if you can hear what I'm saying, these are very much aligned to the components of the application and the platform, and not at all aligned to how our business users needed to interact with the platform. And so things ended up being quite fragmented. And, a group that might have been doing some financial reporting requirement, or that might have been running some risk calculations, they were like, well, how do I know which of the requirements you're dealing with are my requirements? Well, let's check with the ingestion team, and let's check with the processing team, and let's check with the consumption team. And it was awful. It was absolutely miserable. But it was actually, but honestly, given what we had, given the strengths of people in the team, and given the need to build out these components, we kind of had to take a component aligned view, because we didn't actually have the capability to get our arms around the entirety of the product backlog. And so this actually does also go back to kind of like the respect for people bit, and actually being really cognizant of what your team is able to do. If you actually try to hold yourself to some ideal that you're not capable of executing on, you're going to fail. And you're going to actually fail probably fairly spectacularly. And so you have to be very realistic and pragmatic. And we were realistic, and we realized that we had to build the product up from its component base. And we did sacrifice the customer centricity. But at the first possible opportunity, and this is about 1.5 years ago, we pivoted from being component aligned to customer aligned. And that was when I had assessed that we actually had the capability to get our arms around the entirety of the requirements of the platform and manage a single backlog. Now, from the moment that I decided we were going to have a single backlog to when we were actually managing a single backlog probably took about 6 months. So to think that these things are instant is, you know, I would have liked for it to happen faster, but in the end, when I actually looked at how much hard work it was to get there, I was actually very proud and pleased that we got there in 6 months. So, you know, so one of the things about large scale development is that, and dealing with, you know, with groups of 100 plus human beings, all of whom are like really highly motivated, working very hard, is that, you know, you can't necessarily change the capabilities or change the culture instantaneously. And it requires a lot of repetition. It requires a lot of focus. It requires a lot of leadership. And again, given that we have this very distributed feature team-based structure, you have to have a lot of people who are able to walk the walk and talk the talk, embedded in every one of these pods, embedded in every one of these feature teams, because if you don't have that, it doesn't work. And so, we moved to having product to area product owners, who are ultimately accountable to me as the chief product owner for the product. And those product owners went from, initially the product owners were component aligned, but then they went to client aligned. And now we have a completely client aligned structure. And where we've landed, and so organizing around requirement areas, where we've landed now is that our requirement management, our prioritization, you know, basically the way that we're managing the product is very much client centric. Every stakeholder, every application team that wants to use this data platform has one and only one product owner that they face off to. Their area product owners, and it's really client aligned. And that product owner is intended to have a full view into all the things that their clients need to do. But they also are very connected to the engineering teams, to the feature teams. And we've aligned feature teams to be, you know, so every product owner ultimately is providing requirements to a set of feature teams. And the product owners talk to each other, so that when there are requirements that need to kind of straddle or jump across feature teams, they legislate that. And anytime there's any kind of hard prioritization decision to make, I now have visibility into the full book of work, and I can make prioritization calls. So how do we then make sure that the different components continue to maintain their integrity? How do I make sure that entitlements does everything entitlements needs to do, and data processing does everything that it needs to do, and pulling data out of the platform, or consumption as we call it, works cohesively? We've also set up an orthogonal design authority structure. And so every component has a technical owner. And those owners are, we refer to them as design authorities. And multiple components actually have multiple design authorities. There's usually a lead design authority. So work gets prioritized, and we are very customer and client centric as we prioritize and organize the work that comes in. The feature teams are aligned according to kind of the customer centric view of what are we delivering for which particular business facing and stakeholder facing use cases. But we also have embedded into the groups design authorities who are members of individual feature teams, but who then are responsible for looking across what's happening. What are all the stories that have to do with component A, component B, or component C? And are we doing things with the appropriate level of design integrity? And are people following the right coding practices and discipline? And do people, you know, because we can't lose sight of the broader application architecture. This is not easy. And, you know, and our team is geographically distributed. Even if I wanted to get all of my developers in one location, I would not be allowed to do it. You know, the idea of co-location is one that I very much admire. I like it. There are advantages to being able to follow the sun when you're working in a global organization with users in all sorts of different regions. But our feature teams are all co-located. So we've broken the team down into co-located feature teams. The global team has, right now, we probably have, I think it's something like 16 or 17 feature teams. And so, you know, and our locations are, you know, US, UK, and India is where our feature teams live. And so we're distributed across that. And so we cannot possibly hope to achieve single geographic co-location for the entirety of the group. But what we are doing is we're maximizing the co-location for the individual feature teams. And feature teams themselves are organized into pods, which have some notion of both client-centric and as well as architecture expertise. This is one thing that we've been refining over time. We will continue to refine, but when we just had component alignments, it was actually quite a disaster making sure, understanding what our clients needed to do. And actually, I think we've settled on a pretty good balance in terms of having a client-aligned feature team structure, but having architectural leadership continuing to be component-aligned. And the architects are just developers in the feature team. And so then that brings me then to the next thing: more with less, and large-scale Scrum is Scrum. So we still have to just run plain old Scrum, and people run different variants and flavors of it. Having people who draw lots of pictures but don't actually understand what the system is doing, there's a value to that, but there's only a limited utility to that. Our architects, even those who are not actually writing a lot of code, have to understand exactly how the code is structured. They must do code reviews. They must actually be very intimately familiar with the way that people are making implementation choices. Our developers, for all the reasons that I talked about, need to be fungible. If you are in one feature team and all you know is one component of the application and you only know one stakeholder's needs, then it's going to be very hard to kind of meet continually shifting demands in what we ultimately need to do to grow the platform and to meet the incredible number of clients stakeholders that actually want to use this data platform. And so we need long-term focused hands-on engineers. We cannot have single function specialist teams. We really need to have fungible, diverse teams. We need to make sure that the teams are fully empowered, and expected to do a full degree of test automation, certainly for the functional tests. Performance testing is actually something that we've actually carved out a little bit, but all the functional and regression testing is really embedded in the feature teams. And the architects and engineers are regular members of the feature teams. And those were all different LeSS experiments that were noted in the intro. And then finally, as we've started to get a bit more success in terms of having a product, so this is a shared data platform. And so the whole point of it is that if you want, let's say you want all the employees of the firm, rather than system A loading all employees of the firm in their database, and system B loading all the employees of the firm in a different database, and system C doing the same thing. And people might get different attributes on it. We basically have a common definition of what an employee is, and we load it once. And anyone who wants that, provided that they're entitled, can go and get it. And so, and this is true for all of the shared data sets. And the majority of the data sets we deal with are in fact shared data sets. And so we've actually had quite a few commercially valuable deliveries in the last year and a half or so, and a number of pretty critical functions for the firm run off of, their data is entirely mastered and hosted in this platform. And so as we have evolved our engineering practices and as the capabilities of the platform have expanded, we've also started to expand the definition of done. And we try to make sure that people, as they are upfront developing, grooming their stories, that they are being more expansive in terms of, defining what done actually means. And done now includes all of the functional things that were part of our initial definitions, but it also is starting to expand, and we're not quite there yet, but we're in the process of expanding it to include a lot of the non-functional types of things about scalability and performance and user experience. Those are things that are starting to get embedded in. And again, the more we can define what is done up front, the more we can actually trust that when we go to release the software, we're actually going to get a good working product. And the more automated those tests are, the more confident we get. I would like to say we have achieved continuous deployment. That would be a very fond hope. I'd be lying through my teeth if I said it. We're nowhere near continuous deployment. We do have a lot of continuous integration. Continuous deployment is still something that we need to work on. We need to modularize our platform better. We need to go across APIs a lot more. But ultimately, it's like I said, this is a work in progress. We have an adaptable set of leaders, and I think that really kind of like honing in on a number of the key principles that LeSS embodies has helped the team tremendously. And so I've now talked for a while, and I'm happy to take any questions. I also see that Gene ticked off everything on there except the chief engineer. Yeah, I did touch on all of those lines.
my animated slide missed on the definition of done. So my apologies for that. So Al, it was quite amazing what you just shared. I would like to have this as a controlled discussion for the next 20 minutes because I know people are going to be flooding you with questions. I captured most of them. So not to waste any time, let me give you the very first one that I grabbed. Well, I'm going to not put you in a position where you have to compare LeSS versus SAFe 5.0 or any other version of SAFe. I'm not expecting you to understand this to the extent that you can compare and contrast. So I apologize to whoever posted that question. Next question was, were the automated tests all functional, or did you also have performance testing? I think you kind of touched upon it later on. Also, it says, did you create these as a part of the development process or as a separate project?
Unit testing was embedded from day one. So like even when the team was, even when the product was a much smaller product with a much smaller team, people were had a good unit testing discipline. Integration tests was something that we really started to focus on probably. So this product really kind of started in scale in early 2018. So it's probably about 2.25 years old, like for the team to be operating at scale. About 1.5 years ago was when we realized that we hadn't had enough focus on automating integrated integration tests and really kind of like end-to-end functional tests. And so we did embed it into the groups, but there was a separate team that kind of created the testing framework, and it really revolves a lot around fitness. Although we also have things for user, UI type testing. But we ultimately had to really push it into the feature teams to get really good coverage of the different functional test scenarios, and that now is something which we are. There still are a lot of gaps that come to light, but we have pretty good coverage. The majority of our automated tests are functional tests. We're starting with performance testing. People have started to build out more of a performance test harness, but we're doing some things that, like, our environment runs on premises, but we're starting to look at the public cloud as a potential place to actually run, like a much more a performance test environment that has far fewer variables, because we can run in a more dedicated way without unpredictable things happening. And so I would say that over the next 6 months, I expect us to really build out the performance test suite, and that I think is going to be more of a dedicated focus as opposed to just farming it out across the team.
Thank you. I'm going to be mixing and matching technical excellence questions with organizational design and system dynamics, if you don't mind. So the next one will be, since they're changed to LeSS, and quite frankly, feel free to either say, so I know you've done quite a bit of experimentation with LeSS experiments, but not necessarily a fully blown LeSS adoption attempt. So consider this, decide how you want to answer this. Since they're changed to LeSS, okay, also how many managers so I'm trying to deciphering what I'm hearing. How many managers per individual were there within the organization? As per recommendations for Craig Larman, it is typically 1 IT manager per 100 Scrum teams. So effectively, it alludes to the recommended product centric organizational design when you have a very flattened organization. Maybe you just can talk about the ratio of doers to managers, if this will help.
Yeah. So I would like, just to be totally transparent, we're not necessarily tracking changes to what is the recommended LeSS adoption adoption approach and such. And so if there are recommendations from Larman and company, that doesn't necessarily translate to us changing how we're doing things. A lot of what we're doing is very much experiential and based off of what our own organization is both capable of and how we work. I mean, like I said, we're a fairly large group operating across regional boundaries. So, managers can be defined in all sorts of different ways. It could be people who have career responsibility for others. And in that case, we have quite a few people who are managers in the team because just the nature of financial services career development, you definitely need to farm that out a bit, and so, but that doesn't necessarily really translate into, I think, the intent of the question. We have product owners, area product owners. We have like 5 of those. We have people who are developers and design authorities, and at the more senior level, we probably have about a half dozen of those, but many of our developers also kind of play more of a design authority type of role. So probably maybe 15 to 20 people kind of are in the design authority camp. From a feature team lead point of view, the feature team leads are also, for the most part, developers. And so, they are essentially, we do have people who are responsible for leading each of our feature teams. They're not haven't really fully embraced the self-organizing team with no lead thing. But feature team leads, they might be paired with the Scrum Master. Every feature team has a lead. If you're talking about people who are really doing organizational management, it really comes down to maybe 3 or 4 people. And it tends to be regionally aligned. I have a regional lead in India. I've got, actually the leads in the UK. Most of our leads are also doers as well, but I'm kind of not just part of this team. I have a broader responsibility, but there is a dedicated senior manager leader. Our SRE team has someone who you view as more of a manager, and so I would say we probably have four people who are, I guess, more pure managers. But even the pure managers get very deeply embedded in technical and architectural types of conversations, or in product management.
Good one. Going to the next one. Kind of combining the two. They're both technology related. One code base. Does it mean you practiced a trunk-based development? Did you effectively develop off the head of trunk, or did you branch off a lot and then had to integrate frequently? And I'm going to couple it together with another one that's somewhat related, but not exactly the same. How do you handle integration testing? Is there any coordination done from outside of the teams, or is it somehow a responsibility of the feature teams to raise their hands, and as well as, so effectively it's the ownership of integration?
It's really trunk-based development with short-lived branches, and it is the responsibility of each feature team as they integrate their code into the trunk to identify where they're introducing breakage. We just have someone who kind of like just monitors the ever-expanding suite of fitness and integration tests, and if people have a hard time identifying or isolating where the problem's coming from, then those folks will help, but they're not dedicated to that. They kind of just keep an eye. It really is up to the feature teams to ensure that the integration tests continue to pass. And since you get the feedback fairly quickly, normally if there is a build failure, it can be isolated fairly quickly as to what were the changes on trunk that might have caused it and who needs to then address it. So it's very much embedded into our feature teams. We do not have, like I said, our branches are short-lived, and it really is trunk-based.
Got it. All right. I'm going to mix and match with one question that came ad hoc prior to this event. Specifically, I think you touched upon it a little bit, but maybe you can dive in a little more. Architecture as a part of Scrum versus architecture being a centralized power tower sitting outside and controlling everything in a centralized way. You did mention something about autonomy and then decentralized decision-making, local decision on the team, but at the same time, the question came, how did you handle those PowerPoint architects that sit outside teams that
we don't have them.
You don't have them. Okay, so that's that.
It's kind of, you could say how we handle them is we don't have them.
Okay.
So I'll address that. And so you need both, because if you just have people who are just focused on their whatever, it's a huge platform. So no one person is going to be able to be focused on actually delivering and shipping code in a portion of the platform and keep their eyes and sights on everything that has to do with the broader architecture. And so, so for the most part, our design authorities and architects are focused on whether it might be a component, whether it might be a client's end-to-end needs, and understanding like how that needs to kind of go from front to back in the system. But each of our architects tends to be focused on some slice of how the platform operates. But I do have a weekly forum which I now chair, where I actually bring all the architects together. And I'm not actually shipping code or focused on code, and I actually really care about kind of how the broader platform works. A couple of our more senior architects really take more of an end-to-end view on things. And so while they end up focusing predominantly on some subset of the application or the platform, they do have to keep their eyes on like how their things interact with all the others. And so I would say 3 or 4 of our senior design authorities and architect leads straddle between kind of like deeply focused and kind of platform focused. I try to just basically coordinate and glue them all together. And so we do have essentially an architecture board that gets together regularly and is more of a decision making. Part of it is information sharing, but a lot of it really is about decision making. And so that's how we try to balance it. I hope that was a clear answer. If the person who asked it is not satisfied with that, please feel free to speak up.
And by the way, there was one related to this. What do you do to prepare your developers to interact effectively with your design authorities and architects? That the one that just came live. So that was a prior one. This one's there.
I don't know that we've really done or mandated anything in terms of how to mandate a design authority developer interaction. I mean, I think that it's been a somewhat organic thing because the design authorities are in fact developers and their feature teams. And so, yeah, we don't have any particular guidelines about that. That, you know, we do have standards around, you know, development practices and testing practices and all that, but ultimately it's pretty informal. If you have a question about if you know that you're if you're working in this aspect of the system that you know well and you have questions about how it might interact with another component, you basically, our design authorities are well published, everything's out on Confluence. And so you find the person or the people who are design authorities and you reach out directly to them. There's nothing formal about that.
Excellent. I'm looking at with T-5, so I'm trying to give you a few more questions before we start wrapping. What did you do to change structure to support a culture focus on technical practices and provide safety for craftsmanship? For example, how did you avoid a contract game? And that effectively implies internal contracts, me versus you, as opposed to external legal contracts, which are perfectly fine. How did you ensure that any functional managers were focused on serving those that they had the privilege to lead? What did you do to, so effectively also it talks about force ranking, performance management system, flattening your organization, making developers feel that they want to actually develop and not necessarily climb up the organizational pecking order and the organizational ladder. This is from the yeah.
So the first question, like what do we do to change the structure to support technical practice, technical excellence, essentially? Like I said, that's largely distributed. We have a strong code review, design review type of culture that happens within the teams, the feature teams. That happens as the design authorities are interacting with developers. And so there is no central structure or way that we really mandate that. But again, the actual technical practices, the way that everything from the way that our requirements are captured in Jira to the ultimate coding standards or to what's acceptable from a testing standard point of view. These things are really kind of enforced in a very distributed way, and we do rely heavily on our feature team leads and our design authorities to ensure that everything is being done up to standard. We also do have metrics that we capture around code coverage and test coverage and that sort of thing. And so I would say that there's nothing top down about that. There are a lot of other questions that were part of that, which are, how do you make your developers feel valued, and how do you ultimately performance ranking and such. And so, as far as like the developers feeling valued and all that, look, it's kind of hard because at times we're a very central product or this product that I'm talking about. I have many other teams, by the way, but I'm really focused on the one product here. It's a very central product that there's a huge amount of demand. And so we have to try to do a lot of things to try to offload some of the pressure that's on the team, letting people know that they should not be overcommitting. And if they feel we're overcommitting, please raise your hands. Please let your product owner, let your future team lead know, let somebody know, because we don't want to burn people out. It helps a lot to say thank you. That actually does go a long way. It helps when we actually publish regular postings as to what's going on in the broader platform and what is the what is the value and the utility. We try to bring the team together on a broader, the whole team together for, just sharing information and sharing some of the wins and actually being really honest about some of the challenges once a month. And so we just try to make sure that it's just a culture of open and transparent communication where people are cognizant of things that aren't working so well, and that we're happy to take advice or feedback from anyone, but also more importantly, how much we appreciate the efforts that people put into things. When it comes to performance ranking, again, these are things that are part of like the bank's culture. And so we do our performance management, our performance ranking, and ultimately people are measured about what is the assessment of their contribution to the team. And individual superstars are not what we are optimizing around. We're looking for people who actually make the team better.
Thank you. We have 1 more minute remaining. Al, do you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, or can we steal another 2-3 minutes from you?
I don't have a hard stop.
Okay, so let me just cover 2 more. I'm not taking any more from the queue. Just let me see if I can address this one. Basically, any specific recommendation how to manage projects with machine learning data science within machine learning data science space?
So that would be from other parts of my, I guess, other applications or platforms. And, I think people have ultimately the number one thing I would say is that you have to have a pretty crisp idea of what you're actually looking to get and accomplish. People use these terms very loosely, and they actually may mean some significantly different things. And, and people also oftentimes focus on the technique. And so they talk about like, decision trees or, forests and, and that doesn't really, in my opinion, hold a whole lot of meaning. Are you trying to correlate activities and events? Are you trying to provide insights into what is more likely to occur in a particular situation? Are you looking for outliers? Like, I think people need to come at it from, are you trying to do some natural language thing for a chatbot? So I think people need to express what they want to achieve in true kind of like end user result, customer centric ways, and then kind of back into the techniques.
So there's one more question about so let me just, since you're talking about customer centricity, the question came, how do you measure the business value of what is produced as a data team? Do you observe the end-to-end value? I think it also has to do with the fact you mentioned that what stuff, products and services that you work, platforms that you work on, they're not revenue generating platforms. Maybe that's what's relates this question.
Well, I think at a more granular level, we have our own metrics measuring the amount of data that's flowing through the platform, the number of data sets that are onboarded, the number of distinct applications that are running. So we can measure things about how much data is flowing through. But we also have client forums where we bring all of our stakeholders together, or we focus on individual groups of stakeholders. And so it is a mix of metrics-based things, defining metrics that we think are important and valuable and useful to measure the efficacy of what we're doing. But a lot of it is also highly anecdotal and relationship-based and actually focused on, since we have internal clients, internal stakeholders, believe me, they let us know when they're not happy. And we know when they've been able to hit their deliverables. We know when they're challenged in being able to hit their deliverables. And so it's really kind of a blend of qualitative and quantitative measurement. Probably a little bit more on the qualitative side these days, but there's both, and we'll get more quantitative over time.
Thank you. I'm going to throw one more question at you before we wrap. Could you describe the scope of the platform a bit more? What are its capabilities? Did the team also have to build the IAC layer?
So I could spend a lot of time on this, but to try to just really distill it down. Fundamentally, what we want to do is we want to basically lower the impedance that happens when the same data ends up being used by different groups, but they refer to it in different ways. So first and foremost, the platform is registry aware. You must register all physical schemas that you're dealing with, and you must register logical models. And all data access and all data processing is through a logical model. So if you want to access employee data, then you need to know that the employee model as we have it has a first name, a last name, a hire date, what's your cost center, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to know if the data is actually in a Sybase database. You don't need to know if it's in Hadoop. You don't need to know if it's in the public cloud. your application should be completely insulated from wherever the data happens to live. And all you should really care about is what is the definition of the data. And there needs to be well-governed, well-shared definitions of those data concepts. And so the platform ultimately has to then do everything, because we're kind of abstracting things from if you want to persist data, you're going through APIs and interfaces that says persist this data for me, and it will do it for you. If you're trying to do processing, derivations, aggregations, you need to have entitlements mechanisms in place. You need to be able to pull the data out, whether for application purposes, for reporting purposes, for analytical purposes. And so ultimately, this really is the data platform. Like applications that interact with it, they're fully relying on the application or the platform to do everything that has to do with managing their data for them. And their interface into the data is really through the registration of these concepts.
Al, thank you. Al, I'm looking at the clock. It's 4 minutes past 1. I really want to wrap this for 2 reasons. A, some people already dropped, but more importantly, I want to give you your time back. Before you go and before everyone else goes, I really want to express my personal gratitude. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your experience and expertise and knowledge in the areas that you have talked about. It was a very interesting discussion, I'm sure, for everyone. I have it recorded, and hopefully I will make it available for everyone very soon. Any last comments from you? Perhaps any suggestions to the community? If not, we won't get offended.
I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it was a great experience. We got through the technical difficulties in the beginning, and ultimately, I think that, you know, if you're in a large dynamic environment, there is nothing that you're going to read in a book or on a website that's going to instantly work. And you have to be very realistic about who is it that you have, you know, to work with, and what are they capable of, and, you know, and be realistic in sizing your ambitions and your goals accordingly. But if you really stay focused and you really stay steadfast, then you will continually improve towards the goals that you ultimately want to have, and your goals will also evolve over time. So I think that there's a lot in these frameworks and these principles that really that can really truly help. But flexibility and a dependence on what you and your people are able to do and being very realistic about that is key. Thanks very much.
Doesn't sound like there are best practices, all great ones, but all conditional, right?
I think so. That's my view of the world, at least.
Yep, that's indeed true. Very true. Well, thank you very much again. All the best to you and everyone who joined, folks. Thank you for joining. Stay well, stay healthy, stay safe, and look out for more events coming in the future. And just be well. Okay.
All right. Stay healthy, all. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to cut it. Yep.